The Vatican is home to countless treasures. There are so many, in fact, that truly startling items simply sit on shelves, unobserved and largely forgotten. Just ask this nun, who made an incredible discovery after engaging in some deep research. After visiting libraries in Florence and Vatican City, Sister Julia Bolton Holloway discovered startling documents that had been hidden away. These notes were special, written, as they were, by one of the greatest minds in history. A nun found a note hidden in the Vatican that sheds new light on a legendary historical genius. The archives inside the Vatican are vast, as Holloway presumably noticed as she worked through them. Thousands and thousands of documents are stored there, collected over the course of some 1,200 years. If you were to line up all the shelves holding these files, they'd go on for a whopping 53 miles. This colossal collection has the intriguing name of the Vatican's secret archives, which really adds an air of mystery to things. The truth, though, is the usage of the word secret here isn't what you might think. It actually comes from the Latin term secretum, which simply means private in English. Even so, people's imaginations have fixated on the word secret, leading to some pretty outlandish theories. Wondering what's in the Vatican's archives, some folks have gone so far as to suggest aliens are inside. Ideas like this might seem crazy, but they're fueled by the fact that researchers aren't allowed to access any of the archive's documents until the items have been in the collection for 75 years. Casting aside the more eccentric theories, some of the documents inside the Vatican are, in fact, fascinating. They can tell us so much about the Catholic Church's history, not to mention that of the entire world. And thanks to the investigative work of Holloway, files have come to light that reveal the truth about one of Italy's greatest minds. The legendary poet known as Dante is probably most famous for his work La Commedia. In English, we know this epic poem as the Divine Comedy. Many scholars consider this to be up there with the greatest of all literary works, a masterpiece that shines a light into the life and beliefs of medieval times. Born roughly in the year 1265, Dante grew up in the Italian city of Florence. He came from a wealthy family, which gave him access to a top education. In his younger years, he learned about language and philosophy, subjects that proved very handy in his later life. When he reached the tender age of 9, Dante purportedly experienced something quite profound. He saw a girl of 8 named Beatrice Portinari, with whom he quickly became deeply enamored. The boy encountered her again aged around 18, which all but confirmed his love for her. During his adolescent years, Dante also developed an intense passion for literature. He clearly had a talent for it, as he was taken on as an apprentice by an acclaimed writer of the time. This was Brunetto Latini, also called Bernetto Latino, who'd made his name writing poems and prose in Italian. That was a positive development, but not all was well in Dante's world. Dante had never gotten over his love for Beatrice, but things in that department never worked out. Before they died, Dante's parents had made an arrangement that would see their son marry a fairly wealthy girl named Gemma di Manetto Donati. This happened in 1285 or thereabouts, with the pair going on to have 3, or possibly more, kids. Despite his arranged union with Gemma, Dante's love for Beatrice endured. But tragedy struck in 1290, when Beatrice passed away. Overcome by anguish, Dante went even deeper into literature and philosophy. He devoured the masterpieces of Aristotle and Cicero before eventually establishing a distinct writing voice in his own work. Beatrice's presence could be keenly felt in Dante's work, particularly in La Vita Nuova, which translates to The New Life in English. This book deployed a notably creative style for its time, dealing with the subject of love while switching between regular prose and poetic verse. Beatrice was at the center of this text, serving as an embodiment of love itself. By the year 1300, Dante had become part of the political scene around his home city of Florence, which was pretty chaotic at that time. In fact, when a rival group instigated a coup, the writer and his comrades were banished from the city. He would never make it back there again, meaning some of his more famous works were written away from home. That includes Dante's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. This epic poem was finished by 1320, though its influence would be felt for many centuries more. The 3-part text helped shape the Renaissance and all that came with it. In a sense, this classic really is at the heart of society as we know it today. The first part of the Divine Comedy is Inferno, which meticulously describes Dante himself making his way through hell. Guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil, Dante passes through the horrifying, funnel-shaped space that is hell. Sinners are subjected to terrible tortures here, which Dante explains in rich detail. As Dante tells it, sinners in hell can make it to heaven if they purify themselves. That involves moving on to purgatory, which is the second setting of the Divine Comedy. Purgatory is a more reflective place, meaning that Dante needs another person to lead him besides Virgil. He needs someone who embodies the idea of faith. And who would that be? None other than his beloved Beatrice, of course. And after that, the third part of the Divine Comedy sees Dante and Beatrice pass into heaven, a place of joy and peace. Having been subjected to the horrifying trials of hell and purgatory, arrival to heaven marks the end of the journey. Here, the poet is gifted by God with knowledge related to existence itself. It was quite a conclusion, though it wasn't all happy endings. Dante died only a year after the Divine Comedy was published, meaning he never truly saw the profound influence it had on the world. He passed away in the Italian city of Ravenna, where he'd been seeing out his final years. The date was either September 13 or 14, 1321. Though he was gone, his impact was undeniable. Sister Julia Bolton Holloway, a medieval expert, knew what set this classic apart from its contemporaries. Around the time when Dante was working on the Divine Comedy, epic works of a similar scale tended to be written in Greek or Latin. The fact that Dante wrote his poem in Italian meant that more people could actually read it, which revolutionized the growth of literacy. Dante's work is up there with the most important in all of literature. Many distinguished artists who came later have cited him as a source of inspiration, a figure worthy of tremendous reverence. As T.S. Eliot once noted, Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them, there is no third. Even today, 7 centuries after his death, Dante is still a vitally important literary figure. Given that, then, you can imagine how exciting it would be if a discovery about the man was made all of a sudden. Well, it seems that's exactly what's happened, thanks to the contributions of Holloway. Given Dante's immense skill as a writer, literary experts are incredibly excited to read anything penned by him. So, when Holloway discovered some documents she believed were written by the man himself, it sent academics into a spin. 7 centuries after his death, we now had new content to pore over. Holloway was as delighted as anyone by her discovery, which she believes shows off Dante's genius. That's hardly a surprise, though, as she's an academic herself. She once taught classes on medieval studies at Princeton, which is just one string to her bow. Her life has been incredibly varied. Speaking to the Compass website in 2015, Holloway looked back on her past experiences and described her life as crazy. Originally from England, she went on to become embroiled in the fight for civil rights in America. And later in life, following the breakup of her marriage, she became a nun. Far from being just an academic and bookworm, Holloway has also picked up a lot of practical skills over the decades. She designs websites, she makes things out of wood, and she's dedicated to living in a sustainable way. That involves traveling by bicycle and repairing her own outfits when necessary. Still, though, by her own admission, Holloway takes most solace from writing. She's published several books, in fact, with a recurring subject being women's roles in Christianity and its past. Hearing her speak on the subject of writing, it's clear she sees the process in deeply spiritual terms. Speaking to the Compass, Holloway laid out her thoughts on the experience of writing. She said, "With writing you transcend time. It's a conversation you have listening to Saints Augustine and Monica, you arrive at that silence, which is like the silence of a Quaker meeting, where the Spirit speaks." It's hardly a surprise that a religious writer such as Holloway would be so drawn to Dante. You can imagine her elation, then, when she discovered a note seemingly penned by the great man himself. She'd been exploring libraries in Florence and the Vatican at the time, where the documents were just screaming to be found. The notes were written back when Dante was a student, working under the philosopher and academic Brunetto Latini. Serving as a sort of mentor to the young Dante, Latini is an interesting figure himself. Holloway is something of an expert on the man, as a matter of fact, having studied him extensively over the years. As a thinker, Latini was greatly inspired by Cicero, a philosopher from ancient Rome. Looking to this legendary man's writings for direction, Latini developed his own thoughts on the nature of government and how it should function. As a teacher, then, he passed on some of these lessons to Dante. Latini's influence is clear to see in Dante's more mature works, including in the Divine Comedy. Ideas related to equitable governance crop up in this text, for instance, as does the character of Latini himself. Clearly, the man had a very deep influence on Dante and the ways he thought about the world. Speaking to The Times in July 2021, Holloway explained that Latini is often ignored by scholars, despite his massive influence on Dante. The nun said, Dante reports that Latino was his former teacher, but he really tarred and feathered him in his work, and as a result he has been overlooked. Perhaps it took a woman to pay attention to him. Latino was a real intellectual who spent a great deal of his time learning and studying. His work covered many different areas, from politics to astronomy to philosophy. He was a worthy teacher to Dante and clearly left a tremendous impression on him, as Holloway has pointed out to the Times. Holloway said, Latino was steeped in the classics and during a period of exile in Spain, learned about astronomy and Aristotle's work on ethics, all of which feeds into the comedy. He would dictate his work on ethics, rhetoric, and politics to his students when he returned to Florence. So many of his words appear in the comedy. He and Dante had the same mind. In addition to the author inserting himself as a character, it seems that some of the figures in Dante's Inferno were actually based on characters sketched out by Latini. The older man mentioned them in some of his own documents. These writings, it turns out, may actually have been transcribed by a young Dante. In her conversation with the Times, the nun described the notes she discovered. According to her, the handwriting is schoolboy-like in the early manuscripts, but the writing is in excellent Tuscan, which later provided the blueprint for Italian, and covers the ideas of ethical government which later showed up in the comedy. Holloway is pretty confident these notes were written by Dante. Explaining her reasons, she said, the notes are the only ones written in the so-called Cancelleresca script, which Dante was likely taught by his father, and are the only ones on cheap parchment, which makes sense given Dante was poorer than his fellow pupils. Granted, Holloway doesn't exactly know what Dante's handwriting may have looked like, but she wasn't totally in the dark. As she explained, no copies of Dante's own, handwritten version of the comedy have been found, but Leonardo Bruni, a later Renaissance scholar who saw Dante's handwriting, described it as being similar to the manuscripts I have found. Another feature of the notes that suggests they were written by Dante is a sort of sketch that appears on a couple of the pages. Each one is a square drawn over a circle, a design that is closely associated with the writer. In the Divine Comedy, he uses these shapes as a means of detailing God. Discovering notes from one of the greatest literary minds in history is a big deal, which is why this story has made waves with scholars. Dante is undoubtedly one of the best, and now we know far more about his early career and writing process. For perhaps the first time, Holloway has given us a glimpse of the man behind the legend. And Dante isn't the only historical genius we're learning more about. As one of the most famous and celebrated artists of all time, the Renaissance genius Michelangelo is a historical and cultural colossus. The man looms large over the art world to this very day, but what was the man himself actually like? Was there anything notable about him besides his artistic abilities? Researchers have set out to learn the answer to these questions, and they've uncovered a few surprises. The experts in question came from Italy's Forensic Anthropology, Paleopathology, and Bioarchaeology Research Center, and they had quite an unusual focus for their study. Basically, they put an awful lot of effort into examining shoes purported to have once belonged to Michelangelo. For those of us not involved in the research, that might seem a little strange. The thing is, though, in the hands of experts who know what they're doing, shoes can be very revealing. A lot of information can be extracted from a person's footwear, and not just in relation to their style preferences. With a little care and effort, more tangible characteristics can also be deduced. Most of us have been aware of Michelangelo since we were kids. His incredible legacy has endured across the centuries since his death, meaning that people today have at least their own vague idea of who the man was. This recently published study, though, might just challenge our preconceptions about him. A man of Michelangelo's stature tends to stick in our minds, even taking on a semi-mythical quality. But this research has shown us the human side of the now legendary figure. Despite all his talent and the sheer power of his work, he probably wasn't quite so immense in every department. Michelangelo arrived into the world in 1475, born in a place called Caprese in Italy. His dad worked as a magistrate in this small community, but the family would soon be on the move. While Michelangelo was still very young, they upped sticks and relocated to the city of Florence. Tragedy struck Michelangelo's life early. His mom suffered from poor health, and by the time the boy was just 6, she'd passed away. This disruption to his life meant the young Michelangelo spent a lot of time being looked after by another family. These carers introduced him to stone cutting, which obviously served him well in later life. Michelangelo developed a clear interest in the arts from a young age. Less keen to focus on other aspects of his education, the boy would instead observe artists working in local churches. He'd hone his own skills by attempting to replicate their work with his own sketches. Eventually, he became acquainted with the established artist Domenico Ghirlandaio. It had become evident to Michelangelo's dad that his creatively minded son wasn't going to follow him into the world of finance. So, when the boy was 13, he allowed him to become Ghirlandaio's apprentice. It was under this artist's tutelage, then, that Michelangelo learned the fresco method of painting murals. Michelangelo's immense talent was quickly evident to Ghirlandaio, who recommended that he properly learn how to carve art from stone. The teenager was sent to the palace of Lorenzo de' Medici, who ruled over Florence at the time. Here, in the grounds of this most opulent and grandiose of settings, the budding artist was taught about classical sculpture. Naturally, being in this most elite of environments proved useful for making contacts. During this period, Michelangelo was taught by a prominent sculptor by the name of Bertoldo di Giovanni, but that wasn't all. He met distinguished and intellectually minded individuals from a variety of different disciplines around this time, including academics, scientists and poets. As a true Renaissance man, Michelangelo had many strings to his bow. His interests were broad, and they often fed into each other. For instance, he developed a fascination for human biology and was even permitted by the Catholic Church to conduct dissections on human remains. This experience, though morbid, undoubtedly had a direct impact on his art. One of the defining characteristics of Michelangelo's style is the vivid and realistic detail of his human subjects. The manner in which he portrays musculature, for example, is particularly impressive. This can even be seen in his early works as a teenager, such as Battle of the Centaurs and Madonna Seated on a Step. There were turbulent times in Florence in 1492 in the wake of Lorenzo de' Medici's passing, so Michelangelo moved to Bologna. He carried on with his education here for a time, before returning to Florence when things were calmer. Now, though, he was working as a professional sculptor after years of learning his craft. After spending a few more years in Florence, Michelangelo then relocated to Rome. Here, he was commissioned by a prominent cardinal to create a sculpture depicting a deceased Jesus spread out on his mother Mary's lap. The finished work would come to be known as the Pieta. Astonishingly, the Pieta took the 25-year-old artist less than a year to complete. Even at that time, people apparently recognized the genius of Michelangelo's work. And, of course, that remains the case today. The sculpture has since been rehoused several times, but it can be seen today in Vatican City, a self-contained city-state located within the physical confines of Rome, Italy. The Pieta has a special distinction in that it's the only Michelangelo piece to have his name etched into it. The story goes that he decided to do this when he overheard someone claiming that another artist was responsible. Annoyed by the thought of someone else receiving credit for his efforts, he carved out his name on Mary's chest. For 3 years from 1501, Michelangelo was working on what would become one of his masterpieces. The statue of David had been started by 2 previous sculptors, but both had found the task beyond them. Michelangelo then took over and turned the block of marble into what has since become one of the most well-known sculptures in the world. The statue of David is the work of a master sculptor, but Michelangelo's next masterpiece would demonstrate his genius as a painter too. He was requested by the Pope to decorate the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, a challenge he accepted. This project clearly captured Michelangelo's imagination, and his vision became increasingly expansive as he progressed. Michelangelo soon dismissed every one of his helpers, being unhappy with the quality of work they were producing. He obsessively completed the project alone, spending an incredible amount of time lying on his back and painting the ceiling. The result, which he unveiled on Halloween in 1512, remains one of the greatest examples of Renaissance art. Working on the Sistine Chapel had taken a lot out of Michelangelo physically, and his interest soon turned elsewhere. He carried on painting and sculpting, of course, but his primary interest became architecture. In this field, as with all the others, he demonstrated his genius. He designed several incredible buildings, but his most notable contribution to the field probably came during his tenure as head architect of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. Michelangelo made it to a ripe old age, passing away a few weeks before he turned 89. Leaving behind an incredible legacy and an immense body of work, he was immediately heralded as a master artist. And this reputation hasn't at all diminished in the centuries that have followed his death in 1564. We're lucky to have so many of Michelangelo's works still on show today, as they allow us to marvel at his genius. We all know about his one-of-a-kind abilities as an artist, but what about his general personality? What about his physical characteristics? For certain admirers of his work, these are pressing questions. In terms of his personality, first of all, it seems that Michelangelo had been something of a firebrand. It's said that he had a sharp temper, which put a strain on his personal and professional relationships. His obsessive perfectionism apparently made him a hard taskmaster. Michelangelo was also known to slip into periods of depression, which can be seen in his own writings. For example, he noted at one time, "I am here in great distress, and with great physical strain, and have no friends of any kind, nor do I want them. And I do not have enough time to eat as much as I need. My joy and my sorrow, my repose are these discomforts." In terms of Michelangelo's physical characteristics, we also know a thing or two. It's understood, for example, that he was punched hard in the face in his earlier years, which permanently deformed his nose. In later life he experienced quite a lot of pain too, especially after working on the Sistine Chapel. Questions related to Michelangelo's physicality have continued to interest people, even all these centuries after his death. And in September 2021 a new study was published in scientific journal Anthropology which represents something of a breakthrough in this respect. With the emergence of this report, we now almost certainly know something new about the great artist. As previously mentioned, the study was slightly odd, centered as it was upon the careful analysis of 3 shoes recovered from Michelangelo's household following his passing. 2 of these were matching, while the third was on its own. Its counterpart had been robbed back in 1873, so the experts just had to make do with the one. This was a novel study, as no other had attempted to use Michelangelo's clothing in this way. But the researchers felt that by measuring the shoes, they could give a fair estimate of how tall he'd been. So, what did they find? Well, it turns out that this man with a colossal legacy was probably quite short in terms of physical stature. The experts estimate that Michelangelo was no taller than 5'2", which is quite a bit shorter than most European men today. That might seem to contradict the idea that many of us have of the great man. In terms of his art, after all, he was a giant. While this revelation might initially seem quite surprising, the truth is that it's not really so strange. Michelangelo, as a matter of fact, wasn't a particularly short man by the standards of his era. You see, the average height of Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries was shorter than it is today. Giorgio Vasari was an artist and writer from Michelangelo's own time who once recorded a description of the great man. Vasari noted, "He was of mediocre stature, broad in the shoulders, but well proportioned to the rest of his body." This usage of the word mediocre wasn't as insulting as it might seem, as Vasari used the term in its older context to mean average. So, it really wouldn't be that unrealistic to suggest Michelangelo was only a little over 5 feet tall. But despite the seeming evidence for that, it's still not 100% certain to have been the case. Even though the researchers may have got all their calculations correct, there's still a potential problem. The 3 shoes that were studied are all equivalent in size, which means they likely belong to the same individual. But there's no guarantee that this person was actually Michelangelo. These shoes have always been linked to the artist, but it's possible someone else in his home used to wear them. So we can't be totally sure that this research refers to the height of Michelangelo. Still, though, there's a strong chance these shoes were his, and that he really did stand at 5'2" tall. And that makes this study special, as details like this are really difficult to obtain. In order to figure out really specific details about Michelangelo's physical characteristics, researchers would have to do something quite drastic. Basically, his skeleton would need to be disinterred and then subjected to scientific scrutiny. But that, frankly, would be a really grisly and downright morally questionable thing to do. If we rule out the exhumation of Michelangelo's remains, which we should, then that leaves studies like this one involving his shoes. In this context, we can say that this method of research is actually a far less problematic way to do things. Even if it happens to be a little weird. Following on from the shoe study, researchers have more plans to learn about Michelangelo by studying fingerprints thought to be his. A number of his works bear fingerprints, with one only recently discovered on a waxwork called the Slave. If proven to be his, such fingerprints could reveal more about the artist. All of this might seem like a huge amount of effort to learn about one man. But if nothing else, it just shows what an influence Michelangelo has had on art and culture. He was such an important figure that there are people out there willing to dedicate their lives to painstakingly studying his shoes and fingerprints. Michelangelo is remembered alongside figures such as Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci as a true master of the Renaissance. The power and lasting influence of his work has undoubtedly made him a towering figure of the art world. It's likely, though, that his imposing genius wasn't quite reflected in his more modest height. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.